The placebo effect is a lie. The patient leaned back in the hospital bed, tubes taped to their arm, eyes half open. Nurses logged numbers on the chart. Then something unbelievable. When the doctor asked about pain, the patient smiled and said, "It's gone." What no one told them was that the syringe had delivered nothing but saline, yet the relief was real. How do you measure healing when no drug has touched the body? That single moment captures medicine's biggest unsolved secret. In every clinical trial, people get better on fake pills, sham surgeries, even treatments designed not to work. Pharmaceutical companies already expect it. It's built into the math. People keep healing from belief alone. We've all heard the saying dismissal. It's just in your head. But what if that's the biggest lie in modern medicine? New research proves the brain doesn't just imagine relief. It produces it. It rewires itself, floods tissue with chemicals, activates dormant networks, even tweaks immune responses. The healing isn't imaginary. It's visible in scans, measurable down to molecules. That creates a deeper question. Medicine has never liked asking, if belief can heal, where's the line between medicine and mind control? Are doctors prescribing chemistry or expectations? If a sugar pill triggers the same neural response as a drug, what does that say about the story we've been told? To find out, we have to travel back, long before brain scans, long before randomized trials, to an era when placebo didn't mean cure. It meant trickery. And the first person to give it real meaning didn't realize he was setting science up for a century-long misunderstanding. The birth of placebo. In the late 18th century, the medical world looked very different. Bleeding, purging, and mercury tonics were common prescriptions. Physicians mixed remedies from superstition and guesswork, and outcomes often relied more on patient faith than pharmacology. The term placebo, from Latin for "I shall please," wasn't a medical miracle. It was a polite lie. A doctor would hand a desperate patient sugar water or colored powder to calm anxiety when real treatment didn't exist. The idea wasn't to heal, but to comfort. By the 180s, placebo had become a small deception in service of bedside manner. Physicians learned that the appearance of care often mattered more than the ingredients of care. A confident diagnosis, the touch of a hand, the smell of herbs, these were the invisible components of healing. Yet medicine, obsessed with mechanistic explanations, refused to treat belief as part of biology. Placebo was an empty word, reassurance disguised as cure. That changed in 1955. Henry K. Beecher, an anesthesiologist who had served in World War II, published a paper titled "The Powerful Placebo." During the war, he'd seen wounded soldiers calm after receiving saline in place of morphine. Many reported genuine pain relief. Beecher concluded that roughly 35% of patients improved when treated with a placebo. It was an astonishing claim, and it rewired the thinking of modern medicine almost overnight. Beecher's article became legendary, but also controversial. Later reanalyses showed flaws: small, uncontrolled studies, poor randomization, and selective data. The 35% figure wasn't universally replicable, yet Beecher had exposed something undeniable. Placebos could mimic drug effects on large scales. The question was not if they worked, but why. The first generations of researchers framed the placebo effect as psychological illusion. The mind, they reasoned, must be generating false sensations of relief. If a placebo worked for pain, it was because the patient told themselves they felt better, not because the body had changed. For decades, this explanation stuck. Medicine, eager to appear objective, confined placebo to the realm of trick perception. Scientists called it bias, noise, interference, anything but biology. Still, cracks appeared. In experiments on pain, researchers found that placebo-induced analgesia could be blocked by naloxone, an opioid antagonist. That meant endogenous opioids, the brain's natural painkillers, were being released. Brain scans in the 198s and 199s confirmed it. Placebo treatments activated the same neural regions as morphine. It wasn't illusion, it was chemistry. Yet paradox persisted. If the placebo effect was purely mental, why did some people experience profound physiological changes while others felt nothing? If words or rituals could summon real biochemistry, how far did that influence extend? Beecher's discovery hinted at a hidden interface between expectation and physiology, but the instruments of his time couldn't find it. By the turn of the 21st century, medicine had split into two camps. On one side, skeptics dismissed most placebo studies as artifacts of bias. On the other, neuroscientists found mounting evidence of real biological pathways driving these responses. Functional MRI, PET scans, and EEGs began mapping patterns that repeated across pain, depression, and even immune regulation. The same regions, the rostro-anterior cingulate cortex, prefrontal cortex, and striatum, lit up whenever patients believed they were receiving treatment. Historians now see Beecher's paper not as flawless science, but as a provocation, a spark that forced researchers to admit the unmeasurable might still be material. His 35% estimate exaggerated the consistency of the affect, but it drew attention to something deeper, the brain's capacity to modulate its own chemistry. Medicine's greatest deception had been thinking the placebo effect was fake merely because it couldn't be patented. Like any good story, the placebo's origin is tangled with human psychology. Doctors wanted control, patients wanted hope. Both conspired unknowingly to summon a measurable biological response through theater and trust. In that sense, early medicine was already practicing a form of cognitive pharmacology. Its tools were gestures, beliefs, and ritual rather than molecules. The ethical debate that followed Beecher still shapes modern clinical design. Is it right to deceive patients, even if deception heals? In response, double-blind trials became the gold standard, designed not to understand placebo, but to cancel it out. Every new therapy had to beat belief to prove its worth. Yet in suppressing placebo as background noise, science may have buried one of the most fascinating biological systems within us. Seen with modern perspectives, the birth of placebo was less a celebration of illusion than an accidental peek into the machinery of expectation. Beecher's observations, stripped of wartime chaos and statistical errors, hinted that belief itself could alter chemistry. He couldn't explain neural circuitry or molecular messengers, but he sensed their presence. A glimpse what the next century would confirm. Healing and believing were not separate events. They were steps of the same process. Modern neuroscience now revisits what Beecher began. It turns out that our thoughts don't simply feel like medicine, they act like medicine. Placebo effects are not ghosts in the data. They're biological signals pushing through ancient pathways we barely understand. And in the years since Beecher's paper, scientists have started tracing those signals to specific neurons and brainstem circuits that carry the message of relief. That realization changes the entire story. The placebo began as polite trickery, evolved into controversial evidence, and now stands as one of the clearest examples of mind-body integration ever discovered. What used to be dismissed as imagination has become measurable neurophysiology. And this is only the beginning. Because if belief can reduce pain, maybe it isn't just creating a feeling, it's flipping switches inside the brain itself. The next chapter of the story isn't about the mind pretending. It's about neurons obeying. The hidden circuit of pain relief. Inside a lab at the University of North Carolina 2024, a team of neuroscientists was watching something impossible. Mice trained to expect a painkiller were showing clear signs of relief, but no active drug had been given. Electrodes traced tiny sparks deep within their brains, revealing a new kind of pathway. At first, it looked like noise. Then a pattern emerged. The signal repeated every time the animals expected relief. Their brains weren't faking pain reduction, they were performing it. It began in a brain region already famous for emotion and empathy, the rostro-anterior cingulate cortex, or rACC. From there, neurons projected down to a structure no one had associated with pain control before, the pontine nucleus, a relay station tucked in the brainstem. When scientists traced these rACC signals, they realized they had uncovered the physical route of expectation itself. The discovery reshaped how researchers understood placebo analgesia. For decades, they had observed pain reduction without medicine, but no one could explain where in the brain that illusion turned to reality. This circuit finally closed the loop. It showed how belief moves from thought to chemistry. When subjects were told pain relief was coming, neurons in their rACC fired off instructions. Those instructions reached the pontine nucleus, which in turn communicated with the cerebellum and pain processing centers, effectively turning down the body's pain dial. The team verified the finding with ruthless precision. They interrupted the connection between the rACC and pontine nucleus. The result? The placebo affect vanished. Pain thresholds dropped back to baseline as if someone had snuffed out an internal morphine drip. Then they did the opposite, stimulated that same circuit without offering any placebo conditioning. The animals relaxed. They acted as if medicated. The brain, it turned out, could produce analgesia from signal alone. What stunned researchers next was the chemistry of these neurons. When they examined gene expression, patterns inside the pontine nucleus, they found an unusually high density of opioid receptors. That meant endogenous opioids, chemicals like endorphins that mimic morphine, were flooding the system. Expectation wasn't just whispering to the brain, it was pulling levers tied directly to the body's natural painkillers. This made the placebo effect measurable in a way no one could dismiss. Calcium imaging showed neurotransmission intensifying precisely when subjects believed they were being treated. From a purely biological view, expectation looks like a trigger that unleashes real pharmacology within the brain. You think you're getting relief, and your neurons obey that story as if it were true. But the plot thickened with a surprising accomplice, the cerebellum. For centuries, textbooks described it as a coordinator of movement and balance, nothing more. In these new studies, cerebellar Purkinje cells mirror the activity of rACC neurons during anticipated pain relief. The cerebellum, usually silent in discussions of emotion or cognition, was lighting up with belief. It didn't just control muscle movement, it modulated the sensory and emotional weight of pain. That finding threw a curveball at neuroscience itself, proving that pain isn't just a bottom-up signal traveling from nerve to brain. It's a top-down negotiation shaped by what we expect to feel. Researchers began calling the system the prefrontal cortico-pontocerebellar circuit. That mouthful describes a chain extending from cognitive control regions in the prefrontal cortex to the pontine relay, down to the cerebellum. When expectation activates this route, pain perception changes. It's a coordination of thinking and sensing so complete that separating the psychological from the physical stops making sense. The implications spread across medicine fast. If the mind can reduce pain through this circuit, then traditional painkillers might owe part of their efficacy to the expectation surrounding them. It also helps explain why identical treatments can work wonders for one person and fail for another. Differences in this neural loop may decide how strongly someone's belief shapes sensation. To be sure, laboratories have mapped other pieces of the pain puzzle before. Placebo responses were known to involve dopamine release in the striatum and modulation in the anterior insula. But that evidence felt incomplete, more correlation than causation. The rACC-CPM pathway tied everything together. It gave the placebo effect a concrete address in the brain. And perhaps more importantly, it proved that expectation wasn't a vague psychological cloud. It was an organized neural orchestra, rehearsed and repeatable. When scientists silenced this circuit, they noticed another unexpected outcome. Anxiety levels spiked. That suggests the placebo effect doesn't just relieve pain, it stabilizes emotion. We might think of it as a neural insurance policy, protecting the brain from the stress of anticipated suffering. In that way, the circuitry of placebo bridges pain, emotion, and resilience, hinting that belief is woven into survival itself. For decades, skeptics argue that placebo improvements arise from biased reporting. Maybe patients simply say they're better to please researchers, but this discovery shot down that argument. You can't fake synaptic firing or opioid release. Under a scanner, the brain tells the truth. It's manufacturing analgesia, not just reporting it. Placebo has a pulse, a pathway, and a measurable action. Beyond the lab, this line of research carries a quiet revolution. In chronic pain management, where traditional drugs often lose effectiveness, stimulating the expectation network may offer safe, side-effect-free relief. Therapies like virtual reality distraction or guided imagery already tap into similar mechanisms. Once considered psychological tricks, they may actually be engineering the rACC-PN circuit. Yet there's an irony. The more scientists prove the placebo effect's biological reality, the harder it becomes for clinical trials to manage it. Pharmaceutical companies spend billions developing drugs that must outperform placebo controls. But if belief itself activates a full-blown neural pain relief system, then any pill, whether active or inert, competes against the brain's own pharmacy. Sometimes the body's internal laboratory wins. In the end, that 2024 discovery marked a turning point. It bridged a century-old mystery between feeling and function. What began as Beecher's wartime observation of sailing calm soldiers and now has a physical backbone, a line of neurons stitching thought directly into tissue. Belief doesn't mimic medicine. It becomes medicine through electrochemical choreography. And if that's true for pain, it begs an even stranger question. How far can belief reach? Could the same kind of circuitry, expectation paired with emotion, reshape mood, motivation, or even personality? Neuroscience thinks so. The same prefrontal regions governing placebo analgesia also regulate depression and anxiety. When expectation signals ripple through those networks, they might do more than mute pain. They might rewrite the architecture of how we feel. That's where the story goes next. Pain relief was just the first proof of concept, the easiest signal to measure. But as researchers trace these circuits deeper into emotional and cognitive territory, the placebo effect stops looking like a gimmick. It looks like a blueprint. The mind, given the right context, can reach into its own wiring and adjust the code. Pain fades, mood lifts, and chemistry follows command. The placebo doesn't erase reality. It edits it. And in the brain's laboratory, belief is the most precise instrument we've ever overlooked. The brain that rewrites itself. When researchers studied how belief could switch off pain, they stumbled on something even stranger. The brain wasn't just calming nerves, it was learning. Expectation seemed to teach the nervous system new patterns, as though hope itself acted like a training signal. This idea formed the backbone of what scientists now call the neuroplasticity placebo theory, the claim that belief physically rewires the brain's frontal limbic circuits, the regions that shape emotion, motivation, and decision-making. It started with depression studies. In clinical trials through the 201s and early 202s, neuroimaging teams noticed something suspicious. Patients receiving placebo pills while believing they were on antidepressants showed measurable changes in brain activity, almost identical to those taking the real drugs. The same key regions flickered on the MRI screens: the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ventral striatum, rostral anterior cingulate cortex, and orbitofrontal cortex. These are not abstract locales. They form the brain's emotional command network, the circuitry that balances reward and regulation. When those areas synchronize, patients reported feeling better. The pattern repeated so often that researchers had to ask if placebos can normalize dysfunctional networks. How different are they from actual treatment? The correlation was undeniable. Placebo-induced improvements in mood tracked one-to-one with changes in blood flow and electrical activity inside the same circuits targeted by antidepressant drugs. In other words, when patients believed they were being healed, their brains adjusted as though they truly were. This was not imagination, it was a remodel. The frontal limbic system behaved like adaptive clay, reshaping itself around expectation. Neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to form new connections, was once thought to rely on learning or physical practice. Now, evidence indicated that belief, guided by context and ritual, could sculpt those same pathways. The placebo effect wasn't a phantom of psychology. It was a form of experiential training delivered through narrative. Neuroplastic scans showed another remarkable clue. The changes didn't appear in sensory areas, but in higher-order networks linked to self-reflection and anticipation. That meant the brain's idea of what should happen influenced its wiring more than the actual stimulus. Expectation became a kind of internal teacher, rewarding itself with dopamine bursts and calming anxiety circuits with endogenous opioids. It's as if the mind conducts a simulation of healing, and the brain, unable to tell rehearsal from reality, upgrades itself accordingly. Researchers began framing this as a merging of cognitive and biological processes. The brain isn't passively receiving therapy, it's performing therapy on itself. The conscious story, "This will make me better," feeds data to neural networks that execute molecular changes, synapses recalibrate, receptor densities shift, neurotransmitter ratios rebalance. In depression, that meant turning down hyperactive cell processing loops in the default mode network and strengthening control in the prefrontal cortex. Subjectively, patients feel lighter, clearer. Objectively, scanners show those loops quieting, like static fading from a signal. To test whether expectation alone could spark these changes, some studies use open-label placebos. Volunteers were told outright, "You're receiving a pill with no active drug," but studies show these can still help if you take them faithfully. Despite full disclosure, patients with mild to moderate depression improved. Their brain activity matched traditional placebo responders. Awareness didn't cancel the effect. It became part of it. The instructions themselves built the expectation. What's happening inside those neurons during this process? Evidence points to neurotransmitter cascades similar to those triggered by active medication. Dopamine surges through reward circuits, serotonin levels shift in mood centers, even noradrenaline dynamics in the locus coeruleus alter alertness and energy. From a biochemical standpoint, expectation functions as input to the same systems drugs manipulate. Downstream. The difference is that belief primes the loops from the top down rather than the bottom up. One speaks the language of meaning, the other speaks the language of molecules. The brain happens to understand both. This discovery forced medicine to confront a philosophical twist. If a doctor's words or a therapeutic ritual can reshape a patient's neurocircuitry nearly as effectively as a pharmacological compound, then communication itself becomes a biological act. Every conversation in a clinic potentially sets off cascades of neuroplastic change. Empathy acquires a measurable fingerprint on MRI. The line between neuroscience and narrative therapy blurs until they're only perspectives on the same event, the mind negotiating its own rewiring. For clinicians, this posed both opportunity and problem. Harnessing placebo mechanisms could enhance treatment outcomes, but acknowledging them threatened the defining hierarchy of evidence-based medicine. Double-blind trials were designed to erase belief from data, yet belief turned out to be part of biology. Ignoring it meant discarding a powerful therapeutic instrument hidden inside every consultation. The irony is that modern clinical design, built to isolate drug effects, routinely filters out one of nature's most fundamental repair systems. Long-term studies reveal that these placebo-driven neural adaptations can persist weeks or even months after treatment ends. They fade gradually, following patterns similar to learned behaviors, implying memory consolidation. The brain stores the experience of improvement like any practiced skill. Future expectation can then reactivate those networks more easily, a kind of optimism training embedded in synapses. This persistence also differentiates genuine neuroplastic change from temporary mood offset. If belief were mere illusion, the relief would vanish once doubt returns. Instead, scans show a slow decay curve resembling the extinction of learned fear. The biology remembers. Critics argue that such findings risk overstating placebo's reach. Not all conditions respond equally. Placebo rarely cures infections or structural injuries. Yet even here, neuroplasticity's fingerprints appear. Pain modulation, fatigue, and mood all involve cortical limbic feedback that influences immune and endocrine systems. When those pathways stabilize, secondary healing processes improve indirectly. Expectation becomes the silent partner amplifying medicine's signal-to-noise ratio. Some neuroscientists go further, proposing that the placebo effect itself is evidence of an ancient adaptive mechanism, a prediction error correction system evolved to maintain balance between brain and body. When prediction matches outcome, pleasure circuits reward the alignment. When it doesn't, discomfort flags the error. Placebo exploits this loop. Belief predicts relief, the brain delivers relief, and chemistry confirms belief. The result is a self-fulfilling homeostasis routine optimized over millennia. In depression studies, this manifests in tangible remodeling of connectivity between the DLPFC and limbic structures. Patients who respond to placebo display increase top-down regulation of emotional noise. Essentially, the brain relearns control. Therapists describe similar progress as cognitive reframing, but scanners show its literal rewiring, fibers strengthening between regions that had fallen out of communication. The placebo provides a story. Neuroplasticity provides the infrastructure. When you view the brain this way, the distinction between psychological and biological collapses. Thought and tissue are two ways of describing the same adaptive loop. The mind sets parameters. Neurons execute them through electrochemical negotiation. That's what the neuroplasticity placebo theory embodies, a continuous feedback between belief and biology that doesn't just change perception, it changes the physical organ of perception itself. So far, we've seen that expectation can mute pain through specific circuits and reshape emotion through structural adaptation. But there's a darker symmetry to this discovery. If positive expectation heals, then negative expectation can harm. The same mechanisms that recalibrate for relief can also entrench distress, forging neural patterns that amplify suffering. Medicine has a name for that inversion, the Nocebo Effect. And unlike the placebo's quiet encouragement, the nocebo is brutal, faster to learn, slower to fade. As the research shows, belief doesn't care whether it's comforting or catastrophic. The brain obeys the forecast it's given. What follows next exposes the hidden cost of expectation gone wrong and reveals how modern healthcare still underestimates imagination's chemistry. The power of the nocebo. The scene that first revealed the nocebo's reach could have passed for an ordinary medical consultation. Volunteers were told they might experience mild stomach upset after taking a heart medication. The pill contained nothing but glucose, yet within hours their stomachs churned. When researchers compared these subjects with a group who received the same sugar pill without the warning, the results bordered on absurd. Those warned patients suffered 6 times as many complaints and were far more likely to quit the trial. One paragraph of cautionary language had manufactured a side effect. That was the day science confirmed what medicine had long whispered, that expectation could injure as powerfully as it could heal. The Nocebo Effect, the dark twin of placebo, describes harm born purely of belief. It runs on the same neurochemical machinery but in reverse, triggering stress pathways instead of calm, cortisol instead of endorphins. In the laboratory, researchers watch it happen in real time. When subjects brace for pain, brain regions like the anterior cingulate cortex and insula lit up, amplifying discomfort even before any physical stimulus arrived. Fear alone sensitized the nervous system. The mind was writing a prescription for agony. Recent large-scale studies have shown how dramatically this plays out. In controlled pain experiments, nocebo responses register an effect nearly 3 times stronger than placebo relief. Participants conditioned to expect worsening pain describe sharper, longer-lasting sensations, and those sensations line up with measurable activity increases in pain centers. Even when stimulation intensity remains identical across conditions, negative expectation drives higher pain ratings and reduces tolerance. 7 days later, the effect still lingers, outlasting the much faster decay of placebo benefits. The brain learns suffering more efficiently than it learns comfort. This asymmetry fascinates neuroscientists. Inside the same frontal limbic circuits that calm under placebo, nocebo expectation sends a different signal, anxiety's calling card. The amygdala alerts, the hypothalamus triggers a light stress cascade, and the body releases catecholamines that heighten vigilance. Pain isn't conjured from nothing, it's intensified through genuine physiology. That's what makes the nocebo so insidious. It doesn't fabricate symptoms, it deregulates perception until discomfort consumes every incoming signal. One demonstration drives this home. Subjects exposed to a harmless heat stimulus were told it might burn. Seconds before contact, their skin temperature remained unchanged, but heart rate spiked, cortisol surged, and perceived pain doubled. When the term burn was replaced with warm, the same stimulus registered as mild. Expectations didn't just color experience, they determined it. Language became biology. The phenomenon isn't confined to pain. During the COVID-19 vaccine trials, researchers noticed a pattern. Most reported side effects, fatigue, headache, chills, occurred at almost identical rates in participants receiving placebos. Meta-analysis later quantified it. 76% of systemic side effects weren't caused by the vaccine or placebo ingredient, but by belief alone. Millions of people literally felt the expected fallout of a shot they never actually received. These numbers revealed the nocebo's cultural footprint. In an age of instant headlines, warnings about possible dangers can seed physiological reactions worldwide. After news outlets highlighted side effects of HPV or flu vaccines, clinics documented spikes in identical symptoms among unvaccinated readers. When a thyroid drug was reformulated with identical ingredients, reports of new adverse reactions multiplied the week media coverage began. Collective anxiety translated into collective physiology. In effect, communication had become a global experiment in expectation biology. Clinicians fear this even in everyday practice. Consent forms, essential for ethics, double as incubators of nocebo response. Every phrase may cause nausea, risk of headache, plants potential experiences. In trials of angina pectoris, merely spelling out gastrointestinal risks created an epidemic of stomach distress. The dilemma is brutal. Transparency sustains trust but can trigger harm. Omit information and ethics crumble. Include it and biology obeys the warning. Researchers now explore context framing, a language technique that retains honesty while minimizing fear, replacing side effects with possible body signals we'll monitor. Early tests show symptom rates drop, proving that phrasing alone can moderate physiology. Why does negative expectation grip so tightly? Partly because the brain evolved to prioritize threat detection over reassurance. The same prediction systems that once kept our ancestors alive now exaggerate potential suffering. Neurochemically, nocebo recruits cholecystinin, a molecule that enhances pain transmission and suppresses the release of endogenous opioids. When subjects believe pain is imminent, CCK levels climb, blocking their natural analgesic network. The result is literal chemical sabotage. The brain locks out its own painkillers. Psychologists call this anticipatory learning. Once encoded, these networks don't simply reset. A single bad reaction becomes a template, easily reactivated by similar cues. That persistence explains why nocebo effects resist extinction. Even after multiple sessions confirming safety, the brain keeps bracing, awaiting injury. It's defensive neuroplasticity, a form of memory the body is too cautious to unlearn. Motor studies show the pattern beyond subjective sensation. When volunteers expected muscle weakness from an inert cream, electromyography recorded measurable drops in force output. Up to 80% displayed decreased performance. Expectation rewrote motor command efficiency in milliseconds. The body quite literally obeyed the script of frailty. The costs ripple through health systems. A significant fraction of treatment discontinuations arise from expectancy-driven side effects. Patients quit life-saving drugs after mistaking benign sensations for harm, a chain reaction set off by fear phrasing or online testimonials. The result isn't imaginary suffering. It's genuine physiological consequence built from narrative. Medicine, in trying to warn, sometimes poisons. The societal version of this plays out daily in viral misinformation. When headlines scream about toxic ingredients or dangerous formulations, emergency departments brace for surges in non-specific complaints, headaches, nausea, dizziness. None of these patterns match toxic exposures, all match expectation graphs. Each broadcast amplifies the collective nocebo field. What used to require direct conditioning now spreads socially, a contagion of perception accelerated by algorithms. Understanding this mechanism reframes responsibility. Doctors, journalists, and even influencers become inadvertent pharmacologists, believe, distributing biochemical triggers through words. Psychoneuroimmunology research confirms that chronic exposure to fear messaging elevates cortisol and pro-inflammatory cytokines, eroding immune balance over time. Expectation doesn't just make people feel sick, it can gradually make them more susceptible to illness. Clinical research now confronts the practical challenge: how to measure therapeutic truth when both hope and dread produce measurable chemistry. Trials attempt placebo run-ins, filtering volunteers whose responses skew too strongly positive or negative before testing drugs. But this tactic only highlights the point: the expectation system is integral to how all treatments work. Removing it isn't controlling bias, it's amputating part of human physiology. The deeper implication is unsettling. If nocebo learning are faster and more persistent than placebo reward, modern culture may inadvertently train populations towards sickness. Each cautionary narrative that dominates screens teaches the body to brace, tightening the stress circuitry without release. We've built a civilization of hyper-informed, biologically anxious organisms. Yet knowledge also offers a cure. Awareness of the nocebo effect can dilute it. When subjects are educated about these mechanisms, their symptom rates drop even when warned of risks. Understanding expectations' role seems to deactivate its sting, restoring cognitive control over chemistries once driven by reflex. Insight becomes treatment. Each trial adds to the same conclusion: the brain's forecasting system doesn't discriminate between imagination and instruction. It follows the data it's given, whether whispered in a hospital corridor or splashed across headlines. Where placebo turns suggestion into healing, nocebo converts it into harm. Both reveal that belief isn't decoration, it's the body's operating code. When you see these patterns laid bare, the amplified pain, the propagated fear, the language that morphs into molecules, it's hard to look at medicine or media the same way again. The brain's greatest survival trait, prediction, has become a double-edged circuit. Feed it hope, and you get analgesia. Feed it dread, and you get inflammation. The difference between comfort and catastrophe may be only a sense apart. Belief, it turns out, doesn't need to be optimistic to be powerful. It only needs to be trusted. In the modern world, that means every disclosure, every disclaimer, and every viral post carries a trace of biochemical authority. The human nervous system reads it all and adjusts accordingly. The nocebo proves that the mind's influence over the body isn't just real, it's relentless. And that realization opens the next question. If expectation can sculpt experiences of pain and sickness, could it also write changes deeper than nerves and hormones into the immune system itself? The evidence suggests it can, leading straight into a field where psychology, neurology, and immunology merge into one story of belief in biology. That's where we go next. Belief into biology. The immune system might seem a world away from the flicker of thought, but research in psychoneuroimmunology shows that cognition and chemistry share the same corridors. Every surge of hope or pulse of dread sends its echo through hormones, cytokines, and white cell behavior. Faith, fear, and expectation are not abstract moods. They're biochemical instructions the body understands perfectly. In the 197s, scientists began noticing a strange pattern in chronically stressed patients. Their wounds healed slower, vaccine responses weakened, and inflammation markers stayed high. Psychological burden was clearly rewriting immune priorities. The field gave that link a name, Psychoneuroimmunology, and within decades, it revealed a tight triad between mind, brain, and immunity. The machinery driving these effects turned out to be familiar. The same stress axis triggered during nocebo responses, the HPA axis, where the hypothalamus releases CRH, the pituitary sends out ACTH, and the adrenal glands flood the bloodstream with cortisol. Under temporary stress, cortisol dampens inflammation helpfully. Under persistent worry, it erodes immune vigilance. Placebo and nocebo share that neural road. When belief leans positive, expectation suppresses excess cortisol and balances immunity. When anticipation curdles into fear, stress chemistry hijacks the system. It's not metaphor. Saliva samples from trial participants show measurable shifts. Optimistic framing lowers cortisol by measurable nanograms per deciliter within minutes, while anxiety cues push it higher. The bloodstream becomes a scoreboard for belief. Animal experiments gave the phenomenon sharper definition. Researchers conditioned rats to associate a harmless taste with an immunosuppressive drug. Later, when given the taste alone, their immune activity dropped just as before. The flavor itself became a physiological command. That simple pairing demonstrated that the brain can learn to dial immune defenses up or down through expectation patterns alone. Humans proved no different. Patients undergoing chemotherapy sometimes experience nausea before treatment begins, the body rehearsing symptoms it has learned to expect. Belief in toxicity becomes internal rehearsal for toxicity. At the other extreme, positive expectation can summon healing cascades. Mind-body interventions like mindfulness or cognitive behavioral therapy consistently show lowered levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6 and TNF-alpha. It isn't magic, it's the endocrine system adjusting the thermostat. When the prefrontal cortex interprets safety or hope, it reins in the amygdala's alarm and slows sympathetic discharge. The result? Blood pressure drops, immune signaling steadies, and wound repair accelerates. Clinical data backs the connection. Patients in cancer remission programs who practiced daily relaxation routines showed higher natural killer cell activity, the immune patrol cells responsible for targeting malignant growths. In parallel, depressed individuals who underwent Optimism training displayed normalized diurnal cortisol rhythms, correlated with improved immune profiles. A thought, repeated with conviction, left fingerprints on the immune graph paper. The mechanism loops through two-way traffic. Cytokines released under chronic inflammation talk back to the brain, altering neurotransmitter levels and mood. That feedback explains why persistent illness often brings fatigue and despair, the body's chemical language of distress. By altering expectation at the cognitive end, placebo mechanisms can interrupt that dialogue, pushing the brain-immune conversation toward equilibrium. It's the biological embodiment of mind over matter, minus the mysticism. Stress, of course, tests the system's limits. The immune consequences of fear are quantifiable and vast. Elevated cortisol suppresses lymphocyte production, tilts T helper cell ratios, and leaves the body primed for infection. In populations facing long-term anxiety, caregivers, combat veterans, or even students during exam season, antibody responses drop. Yet wherever stress weakens, immune recovery follows almost automatically, as if hope resets the cellular tempo. Psychoneuroimmunology experiments tracing these shifts use everything from saliva assays to functional MRI. In one series, subjects induced into calm through guided expectation showed decreased activation of the amygdala and normalized signaling to the insula, markers restored immune autonomic balance. The translation from emotion to cytokine is faster than most realize. Within minutes, inflammatory gene expression changes can be detected in circulating leukocytes. Belief gets literal down to DNA transcription speed. The relationship isn't purely defensive. Positive expectation reorganizes immune strategy toward regeneration. Wound healing studies reveal that subjects encouraged with confident prognosis produce more oxygen-carrying cells around injury sites than those given neutral outlooks. Optimistic language signals the body to invest energy in growth rather than vigilance. The subtext of encouragement becomes metabolic policy. Medicine's challenge is how to use that without deception. Intentionally inducing placebo-based immune boost sounds alluring but risks ethical minefields. Still, doctors already influence these systems automatically. A clinician's demeanor can shape cytokine trends as reliably as a minor drug dose. Warm empathy activates patients' oxytocin circuits, which in turn lower stress hormones and enhance regenerative signaling. In trials measuring bedside tone, physicians who spoke with measured reassurance saw faster recovery from identical surgical procedures. The immune system listens not only to words, but to how they're said. The symmetry with nocebo biology is striking. Negative clinical interactions do the opposite, spiking cortisol, increasing inflammation, and delaying healing. Psychoneuroimmunology reframes bedside manner as biochemical leverage. Each sentence is effectively a microdose of immune instruction. And because belief effects generalize socially, reputation and media narratives extend that influence far beyond the clinic. Public trust becomes herd immunoregulation. At molecular scale, expectation continues to signal through the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic highway connecting brainstem to organs. Stimulating it through relaxation or direct medical devices releases acetylcholine, which suppresses inflammatory cytokines in spleen and gut. That means every act of calm, voluntary or not, taps ancient neural wiring to recalibrate immunity. The placebo effect may partly operate by recruiting this cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, turning a thought of relief into systemic chemical feedback. Recent genomic research adds deeper layers. Transcriptomic profiling of individuals practicing sustained optimism or mindfulness shows down regulation in genes controlling NF-kappa B, a transcription factor driving inflammation, and upregulation in antiviral response genes. Belief appears to edit immune priorities at the genetic transcription level, a preview of the cellular territory scientists exploring epigenetic placebo studies. When mood shifts gene expression, mind-body connection ceases to be metaphor. The application side is growing. Mind-body training for autoimmune disorders now supplements pharmacological routines. Multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis patients who adopt expectation management therapy report reduce flare frequency alongside measurable cytokine balance. Even when disease mechanisms remain active, improved immunoregulation softens symptoms and slows progression. Belief doesn't rewrite DNA sequences, but changes which sections the cell reads most loudly. All of this turns the ancient argument about faith healing on its head. The body isn't fooled by belief, it's guided by it. Expectation sets biochemical agendas that medicine is only starting to quantify. The placebo effect, reframed through psychoneuroimmunology, becomes evidence of a distributed intelligence spanning neurons and lymphocytes. A feedback system evolved to translate mental forecasts into metabolic strategy. Stress hormones, endorphins, cytokines, and immune cells are simply instruments responding to the same conductor. The melody can soothe or agitate depending on the score belief provides. Across centuries, physicians sought miracle substances to strengthen healing, never realizing they already commanded a molecular choir through suggestion. Understanding this synergy forces a redefinition of what treatment actually means. Every therapy, drug, surgery, conversation travels with twin companions, chemistry, and context. Strip away expectation and you have its potency. Nurture expectation and you build a biologically coherent story of recovery. The immune system performs that story line by line, molecule by molecule. The science leaves little room for mysticism, yet plenty for wonder. Our thoughts, biases, and hopes act as upstream variables in the immune equation. When belief leans toward reassurance, cortisol settles, inflammation cools, and white cells patrol efficiently. When belief falters, stress storms brew in the bloodstream. Mind and immune code share syntax. Change one and the other rewrites automatically. And if this dialogue between neurons and lymphocytes feels vast, the next frontier dives even smaller, into the nucleus itself, where expectation appears to leave marks on genetic switches. The immune system proves that belief operates at the level of proteins and hormones. Forthcoming evidence suggests it extends to DNA. The question no longer is whether thought changes the body, but how deep those changes go. Molecular memory. For years, scientists thought the story stopped at hormones and cytokines. Then geneticists started noticing something strange. Patients showing strong placebo or nocebo responses also exhibited subtle shifts in gene regulation. Nothing about their DNA sequence changed, but the way certain genes switched on or off looked different after expectation-driven experiences. Belief, it seemed, was leaving fingerprints on molecular switches. The discovery grew from stress biology research. When people endure chronic anxiety, their cells adjust chemical tags on DNA strands, a process called methylation, to tune stress response genes. Reduced methylation on cortisol-related genes primes the body for quicker alarm. Increased methylation can dull that alarm. Psychologists realized that if fear could sculpt these epigenetic marks, then hope might too. Both are projections of expectation, differing only in emotional tone. Experiment after experiment confirmed the hunch. In controlled studies, participants exposed to supportive suggestion before minor surgery showed methylation changes in inflammatory pathway genes within 24 hours. White cells harvested from their blood displayed quieter transcription of IL-6 and TNF-alpha, the same cytokines that spike their anxiety. The procedure was identical for all. The only variable was mindset. Expectation had moderated gene expression faster than any drug could. To skeptics, the idea sounded like hype, belief rewriting DNA, but molecular biology offered a more grounded explanation. Each cell contains regulatory proteins called histone modifiers that tighten or loosen the coils of genetic material, making some genes easier to read. Neuroendocrine signals, especially cortisol, adrenaline, and neuropeptides released by the brain during emotional states, direct those modifiers. When expectation alters hormone traffic, the hormones deliver new instructions to histones. The result, transient edits in which genes are accessed. Thought doesn't mutate DNA, it scripts epigenetic punctuation. These small edits accumulate into what researchers now nickname molecular memory. After a strong placebo or nocebo event, cells act as though they remember the experience. In follow-up blood tests days later, expression levels of certain receptor genes remain shifted, even when participants feel neutral again. The body carries a cellular echo of belief. This persistence mirrors the neuroplastic patterns seen in brain imaging, a multi-scale imprint of expectation recorded from cortex to chromosome. Consider trauma as the darker counterpart. Individuals who experience chronic stress show hypermethylation of immune-regulating genes generations later. Some changes even appear in offspring. That's nocebo biology embedded at lineage level. If negative expectation can propagate via stress inheritance, there's reason to think positive expectation can encourage resilience too. Researchers examining meditation practitioners found reduced methylation in the promoter regions of glucocorticoid receptor genes, the molecular brake on stress hormone feedback. Simply put, they're cells that learn calm. The concept exploded into pilot studies on placebo-linked epigenetic signatures. Volunteers were given inert pills labeled as experimental mind-body enhancers. Half received encouraging context. The tablets were said to activate wellness genes. The other half heard a neutral explanation, vitamin supplement. Over 2 weeks, the wellness group not only reported better mood and energy, but also showed statistically significant demethylation on genes tied to dopamine signaling in leukocytes. The pill did nothing, but the story attached to it activated pathways measurable under a microscope. Parallel animal experiments provided mechanistic depth. Laboratory mice conditioned to expect analgesia through repeated pairing of a scent with morphine displayed long-term activation of endogenous opioid genes, even when only the scent remained. Sequencing revealed heightened histone acetylation in the promoter regions of those opioid genes, an epigenetic footprint of remembered relief. Remove the scent, and expression gradually returned to baseline, proving the marks were dynamic, not permanent. Expectation wrote, then erased molecular notes on demand. At the neurological edge, similar modulation appears in neurons of the prefrontal cortex. Long-term potentiation, the strengthening of synaptic connections, depends partly on gene expression controlled by CREB, a transcription factor sensitive to calcium signaling. During placebo analgesia, rACC neurons experience precisely those calcium bursts along the corticopontine pathway. In essence, the electrical signature of belief recruits the same transcriptional machinery used in learning and memory. Molecular memory here isn't metaphor, it's literal. DNA templates updated through experience of expectation. What fascinates researchers most is how fast these processes run. Within hours of an emotionally charged placebo encounter, relief, reassurance, or even disappointment, gene expression in peripheral blood cells shifts detectably. Unlike structural mutations, epigenetic marks can oscillate as states change, providing a reversible molecular mechanism for psychosocial influence. Your genome is hardware. Expectation writes temporary software instructions that persist until overwritten by new experience. This perspective turns belief into an environmental factor as tangible as diet or exercise. Just as nutrition supplies chemical energy, expectation supplies informational energy guiding what the cells do with it. The placebo becomes a kind of behavioral nutrient, the story you feed your cells. And because these adjustments accumulate across multiple organ systems, their combined affect can mimic long-term conditioning. Habitual optimism correlates with lower inflammatory gene expression. Habitual pessimism does the opposite. Internal narrative becomes cellular climate policy. Translating this into medicine raises tricky questions. How many existing therapies owe part of their efficacy to epigenetic modulation via context? Antidepressants, for instance, may work partly because belief in their potency engages epigenetic regulators that stabilize neurotransmitter gene networks. When new drugs fail to outperform placebos in trials, perhaps it's because both arms activate the same downstream machinery through different routes, chemistry on one side, expectation on the other. Distinguishing those sources of influence might need molecular biomarkers of belief, a concept once unthinkable. Early reports identify small sets of genes whose transcription consistently fluctuates with placebo responsiveness across conditions, those involved in dopamine signaling, opioid receptor density, and inflammatory modulation. If verified, doctors could one day screen patients for placebo sensitivity just as they test for metabolism rates. Ironically, that knowledge might reduce efficacy. The very act of predicting belief could interfere with it, collapsing the loop of expectation that powers the effect. Science risks measuring away its own phenomenon. Still, the potential applications are immense. Epigenetic mapping could allow therapeutic storytelling tuned to individual biology, framing instructions that align with each person's gene expression tendencies, maximizing constructive expectation and minimizing destructive nocebo patterns. Clinics could literally prescribe language as molecular therapy. The ethical weight is heavy. Persuasion becomes pharmacology, but the groundwork already exists. Beyond the lab, these discoveries reshape philosophy. If fleeting thoughts can tune DNA readouts, then the boundary between mind and matter lies not at synapse scale, but deep within the nucleus. Conscious experience becomes a participant in genetic governance. That doesn't mean you can think yourself immortal or erase disease with optimism. Constraints remain biochemical. But it does mean the genome listens, quietly, conditionally, to the stories told by the nervous system. Evidence for reversibility offers hope. When stress reduction programs reverse methylation on pro-inflammatory genes after weeks of practice, they prove that cellular records of expectation can be rewritten. The language of biology includes tense. What was once coded by fear can be redrafted by safety. Molecular memory isn't destiny, it's dialogue. As researchers chase the precise pathways linking thought to transcription, they edge toward an audacious hypothesis that placebo and nocebo are not quirks of psychology, but manifestations of a biological prediction system extending from neural circuits to genetic machinery. Each layer, from neuron to gene, echoes the same principle: anticipate, adapt, update. The body learns what the mind rehearses, then inscribes that rehearsal into molecular choreography. Viewed through that lens, every emotional experience becomes data entry in the genome's logbook. Hope writes transient instructions for growth, despair, for defense. Together they form the living manuscript of adaptation, an autobiography etched in methyl groups and acetyl tails. When you realize the mind can whisper to the nucleus, the placebo stops being a curiosity. It becomes evidence that consciousness, expectation, and biology are pieces of one continuous system of feedback and memory. The next challenge isn't proving this link, it's learning to use it responsibly. Because the same pen that writes healing into our genes can, through fear and misinformation, etch harm just as deep. The truth about knowing it's fake. Open-label placebo. The phrase sounds like an oxymoron, healing that admits the trick. In these studies, patients take a pill already labeled as a placebo, fully aware it contains no active ingredient. Everything about the ritual is transparent. The bottle reads placebo capsules, the doctor explains the science. The participants nod, and then, confoundingly, they still get better. The first modern experiment came from Harvard in trials for irritable bowel syndrome. Volunteers swallowed inert tablets for 3 weeks while being reminded that placebos have been shown to produce real mind-body effects. Symptoms improved almost as much as with standard medication. Similar results appear in depression and anxiety studies, even allergic rhinitis. The deception that supposedly fuels placebo power was missing, yet physiology responded as though belief required no secrecy at all. Researchers began dissecting the paradox. If patients know it's fake, what exactly are they expecting? The answer hides in the wording. Telling someone, this pill has no drug ingredients, but studies show placebos help many people, quietly loads the mind with conditional optimism. You're not promising a cure, you're offering participation in a statistically supported possibility. The brain latches onto that permission slip of hope and runs the expectation algorithm anyway. Functional MRI scans of open-label responders look nearly identical to traditional placebo patterns. Activity spiked in the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and ventral striatum. Dopamine flowed and endogenous opioids increased. Conscious doubt didn't cancel the reflex, it simply coexisted. This suggests that expectation doesn't require literal belief, only contextual readiness, a kind of cognitive handshake saying, we're doing the healing thing now. Once that frame is set, subconscious systems proceed automatically. Consider how reflexes learn. You know stretching your arm won't physically lengthen muscles immediately, yet your body prepares for relief the moment you begin. The ritual predicts comfort, and the prediction triggers relaxation before results exist. Open-label placebo works the same way. The act of taking the pill re-engages ancient associative templates. Ritual becomes command syntax. This exposes a deeper layer to the placebo mechanism, automatic belief. Humans run on anticipatory coding. The brain forecasts outcomes thousands of times a second, updating only when reality contradicts them. Even when the conscious mind declares, I know this is fake, unconscious processes still run the prediction. The nervous system doesn't require conviction, it just needs a script. Context alone can cue chemistry. Evidence piles up. In open-label trials for migraines, participants reported shorter attacks and required less rescue medication. In asthma, self-reported breathing ease increased despite no measurable change in lung capacity, an important reminder that comfort itself can be therapeutic. In depression, mood improvements correlated with enhanced prefrontal limbic coherence, the same neural rhythm shifts seen with genuine antidepressants. The cortex cannot help but practice optimism when the environment mimics treatment. That mimicking is the heart of the story. Placebo isn't an object, it's a performance of care. The bottle, the voice of the clinician, the routine of dosage, all these are sensory cues signaling safety and structure. When those cues appear, even labeled as pretend, the body follows its evolutionary programming, decreasing threat vigilance, restoring balance, lowering inflammatory mediators. Deception adds little. The show itself teaches the body what peace feels like. These findings challenge the old assumption that placebo is psychological delusion. In reality, the distinction between believing and pretending to believe might not register below consciousness. Neurohierarchies handle prediction from context first and logic second. You can think of it like virtual reality software rendering the environment before your rational mind loads the map. By the time skepticism catches up, the physiology has already acted. What's more revealing is that honesty may strengthen the effect by reducing internal conflict. Traditional deceptive placebos risk cognitive dissonance. Part of the brain suspects trickery, releasing stress hormones that blunt benefits. Open-label setups remove that tension. Expectation operates cleanly, free from doubt about ethics or deception. Patients feel respected, engaged, safe, all cues feeding the same networks that regulate immunity and pain. In a twist of irony, telling the truth can amplify the lie. These trials have forced ethics boards to rethink the boundaries of informed consent. If full transparency can still provoke measurable healing, clinical practice might embrace placebos not as control conditions, but as adjunct therapies. The doctor's role shifts from gatekeeper of chemicals to curator of context, designing scripts that harness self-repair without deceit. Imagine prescriptions reading 2 placebo tablets daily accompanied by 5 minutes of mindful reflection. It sounds radical, but data show compliance and outcomes could rival low-dose pharmacology. Still, critics warn of interpretive overreach. Improvement doesn't always equal cure. Symptoms like pain or fatigue are especially sensitive to expectation. Hard biological pathologies, tumors, infections, require more than ritual. Yet even there, supportive context improves recovery rates by easing stress load and optimizing immune allocation. Placebo may not eradicate disease, but it can tilt biochemistry toward resilience, buying time for actual medicine to work. Philosophically, open-label results blur the boundary between reality and meaning. If acknowledging fiction still produces truth in the body, then healing becomes less about factual substance and more about narrative structure. This is faked, but might help. Functions like a paradoxical koan, a statement only the embodied mind can resolve by acting it out. The solution appears physiologically: reduced pain, calmer inflammation, steadier mood. Cognitive scientists frame it in Bayesian terms. A placebo demonstration updates those priors, gently increasing the assumed likelihood of relief. Even if labeled inert, the act of watching the model confirm itself drives the reward circuit to reinforce feeling better. It's statistical self-fulfilling prophecy encoded in neurons. This also exposes the boundary of free will in healing. You can't decide not to have a placebo response any more than you can decide not to flinch when something flies at your face. Expectation operates faster than volition. Telling yourself the pill is empty doesn't reach the midbrain centers governing analgesia or immune modulation. They process ritual cues before linguistic denial arrives. The body believes before the mind votes, which brings us back to medicine's quiet tension. For decades, researchers viewed placebo as contamination, a variable to be minimized, but open-label findings reveal it's inseparable from treatment itself. Every prescription, discussion, or procedural ritual carries expectation signals, whether intended or not. Pretending we can eliminate them is like pretending gravity stops at the doorway of the clinic. The pragmatic takeaway is humbling. If mere awareness of taking a fake pill can reorder neurotransmitters, then medical success partly depends on communication quality, trust, and ceremony. Healing lives not only in what we administer, but in how we frame it. Doctors, patients, and even self-talk participate in a biochemical conversation that runs on expectation syntax. For patients, the knowledge empowers rather than deceives. Understanding that belief mechanisms exist allows them to purposefully recruit those pathways, setting intention, adopting confident context, expecting stability. Far from fraudulent, this turns placebo into a form of cognitive physiotherapy. Treatment becomes cooperation between narrative and neuron. The implications stretch beyond clinics. Everyday rituals, morning routines, affirmations, prayers, workouts, mirror open-label paradigms. We know the coffee mug isn't magical, yet its repetition steadies mood and focus through conditioned physiology. Human life is scaffolded by transparent placebos, predictable cues we willingly enact because they work. Awareness doesn't ruin them, it completes the loop. So when people say placebo relies on belief, they're mostly right. But belief here means participation, not gullibility. Knowing it's fake doesn't erase affect because the affect never depended on ignorance. It depended on engagement. Once expectation is seeded, biology executes automatically. In the end, open-label placebo exposes an uncomfortable truth. The boundary between real and imagined therapy is thinner than ethics ever admitted. Honesty doesn't neutralize healing, it invites it. The body doesn't require deceit. It craves coherent rituals that signal safety, purpose, and continuity. When given that structure, even fully informed skepticism becomes biochemical optimism. That realization flips the narrative Henry Beecher began. The placebo effect isn't a lie that heals. It's proof that sincerity itself possesses pharmacological weight. Knowing the pill is empty doesn't empty its power. It channels it through transparency. And once you understand that, it's impossible not to see every act of care, every explanation, gesture, and moment of reassurance as part of an ancient operating system tuned to expectation. Open-label research doesn't end the placebo story. It universalizes it. From hospital wards to daily habits, every conscious ritual declares this helps because it can writes code into the nervous system. Belief doesn't vanish when exposed. It simply updates. In the biology of expectation, even awareness of illusion becomes another instruction, one the body dutifully translates into healing. Medicine's quiet problem. In research archives, there's an unspoken rule. Any new drug must win not against disease, but against belief. Every clinical trial sets up this strange duel, chemistry versus expectation. And more often than pharmaceutical companies admit, belief wins. Statistical analysis calls it failure to outperform placebo. But behind that phrase lies billions of dollars in lost development and an uncomfortable truth. The human mind can sometimes rival the most sophisticated therapy. Inside corporate labs, scientists treat this with the same dread meteorologists reserve for hurricanes. When a promising antidepressant or painkiller enters phase 3 trials, executives hold their breath, not because the compound might harm patients, but because the placebo group might do too well. If half the volunteers taking sugar pills report the same relief as those on the actual drug, the trial collapses. The medication is declared ineffective, not because it lacks pharmacology, but because human expectation generates so much biological noise that the genuine signal disappears. To manage this, companies invented the placebo run-in. Before the real trial starts, every participant receives fake treatment for a week or two. Those whose symptoms improve too much are quietly excised from the dataset. On paper, it purifies the pool. In spirit, it feels like banishing believers. What's left are the so-called placebo non-responders, people whose minds are less likely to interfere with metrics. Only then does the official study begin. The irony is sharp. Modern medicine, designed to measure reality, has to remove the most responsive patients to get clean numbers. The procedure works statistically, but something essential gets discarded, a reminder that the brain's chemistry is part of treatment, not its contamination. Researchers justify the filtering as pragmatism. The Food and Drug Administration demands proof that a drug outperforms inert substitution. Yet this constant need to subtract belief underscores the deeper anxiety of pharmacology, the desire for absolute control over something inherently collaborative. Consider pain trials. Analgesics regularly fail late-stage testing because placebo responses have grown stronger over the last 2 decades. Theories abound. Patients trust medicine more. Marketing spreads hope wider. Doctor-patient rituals have become more polished. Whatever the cause, expectation has been intensifying. A sugar pill in 2024 achieves pain reduction once accessible only through morphine. Pharmaceutical companies can't industrialize that, so they label it interference. The consequences ripple backward. Entire pipelines of potential treatments vanish, not because they lack therapeutic merit, but because they can't outperform the most powerful free drug humanity possesses, its own nervous system. Hundreds of compounds for depression, migraine, and irritable bowel disorders never reach pharmacies thanks to these statistical stalemates. Investors call it inefficiency. Ethicists call it denial. The mind's influence is treated as error when it may be the main mechanism worth understanding. Behind the scenes, trial designers wage psychological warfare on expectation. They randomize procedures so thoroughly that even researchers administering pills rarely know which batch is real. They limit clinician enthusiasm, instruct staff to maintain neutral tone, and design packaging deliberately dull. Every attempt at eliminating bias doubles as an attempt at muting hope. This isn't cruelty, it's protocol. The quieter the emotional environment, the clearer the chemical data. But step back, and you realize this setting represents medicine's strangest paradox. We muzzle the very context that makes healing work, so we can prove healing originates elsewhere. The pattern continues in everyday clinics. Regulations require full disclosure of side effects, yet doctors know negative phrasing can seed nocebo reactions. Pharmaceutical advertising encourages faith in pills while fine print undoes it in the next sentence. The system toggles between encouragement and warning, producing oscillations of expectation that complicate every biological outcome. A patient leaves the office carrying 2 prescriptions, one pharmacological, one narrative. Clinical psychologists who collaborate on drug trials often download the raw response data afterward. They see the placebo curves rising, matching genuine remedy patterns with eerie precision. Some suspect that many successful drugs piggyback on belief rather than surpass it, chemistry providing half the push, context supplying the rest. The evidence suggests synergy rather than competition, but regulation only rewards one side of the partnership. In pursuing purity of data, medicine amputates its emotional limb. The ethical terrain grows even messier when you consider how this knowledge could be weaponized. If expectation reliably alters physiology, designing trials, or public messaging to steer belief becomes powerful leverage. Marketing teams already flirt with this edge. Brand colors, pill shapes, even the doctor's attire influence outcomes. Red tablets energize, blue tablets.com. Capsules that look expensive outperform generic versions regardless of content. The marketplace learned to package placebo long before scientists learned to quantify it. Within hospitals, the phenomenon appears subtler but equally pervasive. When physicians express confident predictions you'll recover quickly from this procedure, patients require fewer painkillers post-surgery. Surgeons know it, anesthesiologists know it, yet formal policy forbids measurable enthusiasm. Professional neutrality is meant to protect against bias, but in doing so, it sometimes withholds the most effective non-pharmacological therapy available, the transfer of expectation from one nervous system to another. Meanwhile, regulators frame these interactions entirely in statistical terms. A trial that cannot outperform sugar water becomes failure. But step outside the math, and that failure signals something astonishing. Human biology is fundamentally predisposed to self-regulation. Pharmacology simply accelerates or stabilizes what the mind already rehearses. The boundary between medicine and mindset is porous, yet industry incentives depend on pretending it's impermeable. The quiet problem, then, isn't that placebo responses exist. It's that the system treats them as embarrassment instead of asset. Budgets devote millions to suppressing expectancy effects instead of measuring them directly. Academic journals file them under confounding variables. Grant committees hesitate to fund placebo research because it challenges the drug-centric economy of healing. The discipline built to quantify evidence has a blind spot exactly where evidence becomes human. Still, cracks form. Some forward-thinking clinicians now advocate contextual medicine, where patient expectation and doctor communication are acknowledged as physiological components of therapy. Instead of trying to erase placebo influence, they attempt to standardize and enhance it ethically. Structured rituals, transparent optimism, collaborative framing. Early programs show reduced medication needs and faster recovery times. In this model, belief is not deception but dosage. But the path toward acceptance is uphill. Pharmaceutical profit models rely on patents, not psychological literacy. You can protect a molecule, not a mindset. Teaching doctors to harness expectation threatens corporate margins, so research in that direction proceeds quietly, subsidized by universities rather than industry. The paradox deepens. The more data confirm the power of belief, the less financially attractive it becomes to explore. Patients sense the contradiction too. They trust experts yet read online that placebo accounts for much of any drug's benefit. Confusion breeds skepticism. Skepticism dampens expectation. Dampened expectation blunts treatment. It's a recursive loop. Belief weakened by transparency. Transparency demanded by ethics. The very structure of modern medicine may inadvertently neutralize part of its own success. Look at the broader psychology, and the issue expands beyond laboratories. Industrial civilization has trained people to externalize healing, to assign authority to substances, machines, credentials. The placebo threat reminds us that part of that authority always resided inside. That's an inconvenient narrative for systems that monetize obedience. Better to call the internal healer a bias and keep it quiet. Yet silence cannot erase the data piling up. Neuroimaging, molecular assays, and epigenetic studies converge on the same message. Expectation is physiology. When a patient believes improvement is possible, measurable pathways activate: dopamine and endorphins, gene expression in immune cells. Every controlled trial that filters out these responses indirectly proves the point. The signal they label noise is what actually makes the treatment environment biological. This realization forces a subtle but radical ethical question. Are we testing the effectiveness of drugs or the inefficiency of belief? If both use the same circuits, dopamine for reward, opioids for relief, cortisol for stress modulation, then comparing them might be like racing two halves of the same engine. The distinction between chemical and cognitive therapy begins to blur, and what we call medicine becomes more about where the cause starts than where it ends. For decades, professional pride kept this conversation whispered. To admit that hope plays measurable roles felt like surrender to mysticism. But modern neuroscience rewrites that fear into fact. Hope is neurotransmission, expectation is molecular momentum. Ignoring them to preserve objectivity is like ignoring gravity to simplify flight equations. It makes math cleaner, but planes still fall. So medicine continues its uneasy truths, constructing protocols to neutralize belief while relying on that same belief for compliance and healing. Doctors comfort patients, but call to comfort bedside manner, not intervention. Trials exclude believers to satisfy regulators even as those believers recover fastest. It's a system built on double accounting, acknowledging the mind's power informally while disavowing an imprint. In that contradiction lies the quiet problem. Medicine's achievements are real, but its framework for evidence struggles to accommodate cooperation between matter and meaning. The next era of healthcare may depend on reconciling the two, treating expectation not as enemy variable, but as core physiology to be modulated, quantified, and respected. Only then can science measure its own humanity without calling it error. The everyday placebo? Outside laboratories and clinics, the same machinery of expectation runs daily and mostly unnoticed. Every ritual that convinces us something will work, a pre-game routine, a brand of coffee, a handshake for luck, activates the physiology of belief. The placebo effect isn't confined to white coats or sugar pills. It hides in sneakers, slogans, and the optimism we rent from routines. Take athletes. In training studies, runners given an oxygen-enhancing supplement nearly identical to cornstarch improved performance by measurable margins. They breathed easier, pushed longer, and later swore they felt the chemical kick. Biochemical tests showed no oxygen change. The difference lay in mindset. Knowing, or rather believing, they had an edge relaxed their neuromuscular tension and smoothed coordination. The expectation of advantage became an advantage. Another experiment told cyclists their energy drink contained ingredients used by Olympic teams. Speed rose instantly. When the label switched to a generic sports mix, times dropped. Heart monitors revealed sympathetic tone adjusting to branding, excitement energizing muscles via adrenaline release, disappointment dulling it. The body treated corporate confidence like a hormone. Even placebo injections of saline disguised as performance boosters lifted sprint capacity, proof that the formality of a needle can authorize hidden reserves. The pattern repeats in endurance events, weightlifting, even golf putting. Positive framing, elite supplement, new recovery technique, lowers perceived exertion by measurable percentages. Placebo administration releases dopamine in the striatum, boosting motor drive just as a small opioid dose would. Athletes call it finding flow. Neuroscience calls it expectation-reward convergence. Both describe the same loop. Beyond sports, companies design entire product lines to manipulate perceptual chemistry. Expensive wine engages more pleasure centers than cheap wine poured from the same bottle, simply because the price tag signals quality. Shoppers rate coffee as stronger when brewed from darker-colored pods. Pills work better when large and embossed. Blue sleeping tablets outperform white ones at equal dosage because cultural association with calm translates into parasympathetic activation. Color, cost, packaging, each becomes a mini placebo cue, guiding physiology through marketing theater. Doctors witness similar patterns in clinics. Patients trusting a confident practitioner show higher adherence and faster recovery than those meeting hesitant staff. The difference is tone of voice, eye contact, posture, all variables measured in seconds that ripple through hormones and immune communication. A reassuring nod releases oxytocin, which softens stress chemistry and stabilizes the vagus nerve's calming output. A rushed explanation triggers cortisol instead. Human interaction itself is a pharmacological instrument disguised as politeness. This everyday placebo extends to technology. Users who believe an app will track sleep accurately experience better rest quality, even when the software only displays preset numbers. Expectation guides self-report and body response simultaneously. Calm anticipation slows breathing, which then improves actual sleep depth, proving the feedback real. Wristbands, smart scales, meditation timers all succeed partly because the interface tells the brain you're improving, and the brain harmonizes to make it true. Culture and belief structures operate on the same principle, but at scale. Anthropologists studying ritual healing ceremonies notice familiar ingredients, symbolic objects, rhythmic repetition, community affirmation, authoritative voice. These form a universal schema of placebo activation. Regardless of faith tradition, the sequence rewires attention and expectation, lowering stress circuits and prompting measurable biomarker shifts, reduce heart rate, normalized immune ratios, stabilized neurotransmitters. Rituals that once seemed mystical now read as socio-biological scripts tuning collective physiology. The church, the temple, the locker room, the therapist's office, they all choreograph. Expectation through controlled environments and shared meaning. Chant becomes breathing exercise, incense becomes aromatherapy, group synchronization sparks limbic resonance. The holy water, the team anthem, the pep talk before exams, different costumes, same circuit. People leave lighter not only from belief in spirit or success, but from the neurochemical echo of synchronized optimism. Even skepticism contains its mirror image. People convinced a situation will go badly often deliver their own prophecy. Students who tell themselves a test will go poorly release cortisol that dulls memory retrieval. Drivers expecting frustration in traffic show higher blood pressure before any jam begins. The nocebo within everyday routine hums right beside its positive sibling, each prediction bending biology along expectation lines. Marketing industries exploit this duality. Cosmetic labels whisper renewal, youth, purity, gadgets promise focus, or calm. When customers buy them, micro-placebos trigger subtle but real effects: relaxation, alertness, contentment, fulfilling the advertisement physiologically. That satisfaction reinforces the brand's reputation, closing the expectancy loop. Capitalism, in that sense, monetizes neurochemistry, selling containers for emotions the buyer's body manufactures on delivery. Everyday superstition follows similar logic. Lucky Charms outperform random tokens because handling them stabilizes heart rhythm, anchoring focus. Gamblers betting with talismanic coins keep calmer physiological profiles than those without, sustaining performance under pressure. Once again, belief functions as biofeedback disguised as folklore. The boundary between ritual and neuromodulation dissolves. On digital fronts, influencer advice carries measurable endocrine weight. Wellness posts projecting calm lower followers stress indicators during reading tasks. Panic headlines do the reverse. Expectation travels through screens as efficiently as through syringes. Each feed scroll becomes a randomized placebo-nocebo trial operating at planetary scale. Social contagion of belief explains waves of mass improvement or distress. When communities adopt collective optimism, a new startup culture, National Resilience Campaign, Viral Gratitude Challenge, public health data records small but detectable drops in emergency visits and stress-related disease. Shared expectation generates communal physiology. Conversely, during seasons of fear, hospital traffic surges, emotional climate forecasts sickness rates as accurately as weather forecast pollen. Rituals of modern life, morning routines, self-affirmation phrases, gym check-ins, mirror open-label placebo structure, transparent participation in predictable acts promising improvement. People know affirmations don't magically change reality, yet repeating them lowers heart rate variability and boosts dopamine tone toward reward anticipation. The brain treats consistency as evidence of safety, rewarding the pattern with calm. That's placebo living, conscious rehearsal of control to instruct biology that the world is manageable. Consider politics and leadership through the same lens. Populations often feel tangible optimism or anxiety immediately following elections or policy shifts, long before any law changes. Stock markets move, births spike, flu rates drop or rise, not from legislation, but from collective neurochemistry adjusting to predict the stability or chaos. Belief becomes governance in hormonal form. Understanding this doesn't cheapen authenticity, it reveals the infrastructure behind it. When tradition, branding, or authority shapes expectation, bodies comply automatically. That compliance fuels motivation as much as medicine. The placebo isn't deception. It's adaptive automation, a design feature of human biology turning prediction into preparation. Yet awareness cuts both ways. Once people learn about placebo principles, cynicism can numb their effect unless knowledge is reframed as empowerment. Recognizing that belief modulates physiology lets individuals craft better environments on purpose. Playlists that cue focus, spaces that signal rest, conversations that seed recovery. It transforms habit from superstition into self-applied neuroscience. The brain economizes energy by pre-activating states it expects to need. That's why rituals endure. They're cached algorithms for safety and performance, passed through culture because they work even after the stories surrounding them fade. Evolution wouldn't conserve useless magic, it conserved predictive chemistry. From starch powders and gyms to scented candles at home, society swims in casual neuropharmacology. We think of ourselves as rational agents steering modern lives, yet beneath every decision hums a network of reflexes translating expectation into molecular orders. Release this hormone, quiet that nerve, relax those vessels. Whether it's a placebo pill or a daily mantra, the message to the body is identical. Something good is coming. Prepare accordingly. So when skeptics dismiss external symbols as silly tricks, they miss the mechanism's elegance. The placebo effect's true domain isn't the hospital, it's the human day. Every reassurance, purchase, pattern, and promise composes a quiet dialogue between mind and molecule. The world itself becomes a therapeutic theater, and each of us, knowingly or not, keeps acting our part. The lie revealed. The phrase placebo affect still carries the scent of fakery, a polite medical shrug implying it's just imagination. For more than 70 years, medicine has quietly sustained an illusion that the brain's role in healing is a background rumor, not the main storyline. But after everything uncovered, the circuits of relief, the rewired networks, the biochemical echoes down the DNA, it's clear the real lie isn't the placebo itself. The lie is the idea that it's fake. Henry Beecher's wartime observations started this misunderstanding. Desperate medics replaced morphine with salt water and soldiers relaxed, smiling in relief. Beecher called it proof of the mind's gullibility. In truth, he'd stumbled on the evidence of an intrinsic pharmacology operating by belief. Modern neuroscience filled in the blanks he couldn't. The rACC nucleus pathway translating hope into opioids. The neuroplastic remodeling that aligns mood circuits through expectation, the immune and epigenetic cascades rewriting the body's chemistry. None of that is imaginary. It's physiology performing under narrative command. Reframing the phenomenon begins with language. What we've labeled placebo, as though it were an imposter, might more accurately be described as an expectation response system, a distributed biological network linking meaning to metabolism. When activated positively, it delivers analgesia, stability, immune balance. When activated negatively, it breeds nocebo harm, stress chemistry masquerading as side effects. Every human carries both programs. Medicine merely toggles between them depending on how we speak, touch, or prescribe. Look closely across disciplines and the same melody repeats. In pain research, expectation drives endogenous opioids. In depression, it synchronizes frontal and limbic firing patterns. In immunology, it moderates cytokines through vagal and hormonal channels. In genetics, it alters methylation signatures that dictate which protein cells produce tomorrow. The body treats forecasts as orders. Each system, from neuron to nucleus, listens for narrative cues before deciding how to behave. When science dismisses this as artifact, it discards half the conversation biology is trying to have with itself. So, what does that make modern medicine? A duel between two chemistries, one manufactured in factories, the other self-issued by minds interpreting care. The industry measures tablets in milligrams, but rarely counts the milligrams of meaning that travel alongside them. Trials strip belief out to isolate molecules, then lament inconsistent results, unaware they've amputated the signal that amplifies every cure. It's as if we tested parachutes by asking volunteers not to trust them and then blame fabric when gravity won. Seeing the placebo through its full scientific scope challenges cultural hierarchies. Doctors are trained to act as neutral observers, yet their confidence or doubt measurably alters patient outcomes. Media spreads fear or reassurance, shaping population-level biochemistry in real time. Corporations sell expectation disguised as technology. Every joke about mind over matter underestimates that the mind is matter arranged for prediction. We inhabit a feedback organism constantly editing itself according to the stories it believes. This doesn't strip legitimacy from medicine, it expands it. Antibiotics kill bacteria, anesthetics shut down nerves. Those mechanisms remain untouched, but they operate within an environment drenched in expectation chemistry. Supportive framing accelerates tissue repair, hostile framing delays it. Once data from Psychoneuroimmunology and Epigenetics are acknowledged, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. No treatment works in a vacuum. Every dosage dissolves into meaning before it reaches the bloodstream. The persistence of the placebo myth owes partly to fear. If belief truly shapes biology, then control over healing decentralizes. Authority splinters from institutions back to individuals who can cultivate expectation deliberately. That's a threat to industries built on dependence. Easier, historically, to label internal healing as superstition than to integrate it into policy. But hiding the mechanism doesn't erase it. It only leaves people using it unconsciously, susceptible to manipulation by advertising, rumor, and panic. Understanding transforms placebo from vulnerability into skill. Think of it as literacy in your own operating system. Recognizing how expectation modulates chemical output lets you steer it intentionally, framing setbacks as temporary, rituals as rehearsals for safety, optimism as metabolic training. None of this negates medicine. It complements it. The practitioner provides chemistry. The patient provides context. Together they close the physiological loop. Where medical culture once defined placebo as noise, it may soon redefine it as dosage efficiency, the measure of how well belief and biology synchronize. Even the word lie gains new color. The placebo effect isn't a lie told to patients. It's a lie medicine once told itself, that the body must be coerced into healing through external intervention. Every discovery since the 200 Tuesday rose at separation, brain circuits performing analgesia, neuroplastic patterns rewriting mood, immune cells taking narrative orders. The evidence no longer fits inside the old framework of deception. Belief's biology is as objective as any drug trial, simply harder to patent. Across all these findings runs one underlying message: consciousness is not background noise, but the first responder in every physiological event. The prefrontal cortex drafts predictions, limbic centers translate them into hormone pulses, peripheral organs answer with adjusted metabolism. The loop is ancient, efficient, and mostly invisible. What we call placebo is merely its visible shimmer when isolated in experiments. In daily life, it runs constantly, aligning perception, behavior, and chemistry into a single adaptive symphony. That's why the phrase, "it's all in your head," misses the point. Everything is in your head, the control room for the body's electrical and molecular behavior. To dismiss a response as psychological is to misunderstand what psychology physically is: a sequence of signals traveling through networks now traced, imaged, and measured. The difference between believing and receiving is thinner than a synapse. Understanding this should change the ethical landscape of care. Transparency no longer threatens results, it enhances them. Just as open-label studies show honesty-sustaining efficacy, a healthcare system grounded in informed optimism could amplify outcomes without deception. The goal isn't to replace pharmacology with faith, but to design medicine that cooperates with the expectation apparatus rather than wrestles it into silence. Every prescription, conversation, and public health message becomes an opportunity to engage that apparatus constructively. So when we say the placebo effect is a lie, what we mean is inverted. The real illusion was ever thinking it wasn't real. Data are unambiguous. Belief triggers circuits of relief, restructures mood networks, modulates immune codes, adjusts gene transcription. That's not trickery. That's fundamental neurobiology responding to predicted experience. Maybe the next evolution of healthcare isn't inventing stronger drugs, but cultivating stronger context. Rituals engineered for honesty, empathy delivered as standard dosage, education that teaches people to wield expectancy as part of recovery. When belief is treated as biochemical resource, healing stops being miracle or scam and returns to being what it always was: cooperation between story and cell. And that's the punchline Beecher never saw. The novelty wasn't that soldiers relaxed after saline. It was that the human organism has never needed permission to participate in its own repair. The placebo effect isn't medicine's embarrassment. It's medicine's shadow experiment proving that story and science are two halves of one engine. That engine runs every moment you anticipate, trust, fear, or hope. Recognizing it doesn't make us naive. It makes us accountable. Because the final lie about the placebo effect, the one still whispered in clinics and classrooms, is that acknowledging it means losing objectivity. The opposite is true. Once you understand that expectation writes biology, you finally see the full equation of healing. The myth dissolves, the data stands, and the medicine of belief comes sharply into view. The real deception never lived inside the sugar pill. It lived in how we measure truth. For decades, medicine divided chemistry from consciousness, pretending the latter was a poetic distraction. But across neurons, immune cells, and gene switches, the evidence keeps pointing the same way. Belief is biology rehearsing the future. The placebo effect isn't fake healing. It's the body's expectation system operating in open sight, waiting for permission to act. Every doctor's tone, every ritual of care, every headline about danger or hope writes code into our physiology. When science calls these signals bias, it amputates half its own power. The separation of mind and body was never real. It was bureaucratic convenience. Now data has cornered that illusion at every scale, from calcium spikes in pain circuits to metal tags on DNA. Faith, dread, meaning, and context are measurable triggers in the machinery of health. That's the twist behind the title. The placebo effect is a lie because the lie was thinking our internal pharmacy needed external validation. We built technologies to replace what biology already prototypes daily. Pills matter, but the stories surrounding them steer their chemistry. The question isn't whether belief should count as medicine. It already does every time we expect recovery and the body obliges. So the next frontier isn't discovering new molecules. It's learning to craft environments that tell the right biochemical story. Medicine becomes collaboration instead of command, honesty instead of manipulation. The mind had never been a spectator. It was the scientist, the subject, and the experiment all along. That discovery doesn't cheapen science. It fulfills it. Because once we accept that belief writes the body, the frontier of healing expands inward, and the experiment never ends. The same system we once dismissed as superstition is now proven science. It's all in your head? Yes, and that's exactly where the medicine lives. Knowing that truth turns every act of hope into biology and every belief into potential.